What we're going to do in this video is dig a little bit deeper into our understanding of multiplication. And just as an example, we're going to use 4 times 7. And some of you might know what 4 times 7 is, but even in this case, I think you might get something from this video because we're going to think about how you can break down a multiplication question into simpler parts. And that's going to be useful well beyond 4 times 7. It's going to be useful in your future when you're tackling more and more complicated things. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can visualize 4 times 7. My favorite way is to visualize it with angry cats. So let's bring on the angry cats. Meow. Yep, they're still angry. And we can see that this is a representation of 4 times 7. We have 4 rows right over here, 4 rows, and each of those rows have 7 cats. And so you can see that right over here. Each of those rows have 7 cats. Some people would call this a 4 by 7 grid or 4 by 7 array, however you'd want to view it. But if someone were to ask you what's the total number of cats, it would be 4 rows times 7 columns, 4 times 7. Now, another way to represent 4 times 7 is also with a tape diagram. You might see something like this, where here we're visualizing it as 7 4s, or you could view it as 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. Now that's all well and good, and you can add that up if you like. But what I promised you is that we would figure out ways to break down things that might simplify things in the future. Well, what if you didn't know what 4 times 7 is, but you knew what 4 times 5 is, and you knew what 4 times 2 is? Well, what's interesting is that 7 is 5 plus 2. So what if we tried to first figure out this many cats? So 4 rows and 5 columns right over there. And then we tried to figure out this many cats, 4 rows and 2 columns. And you can see that it's the exact same number of cats. So one way to think about it is 4 times 7 is the exact same thing as 4 times, and I'm going to use parentheses, and that just means to do that part first, is equal to 4 times. Instead of 7, I could write that as 5 plus 2, because that's what 7 is. So all this is saying is 4 times 7 is the same thing as 4 times 5 plus 2, where you do the 5 plus 2 first because we have those parentheses around it, and 5 plus 2 is indeed equal to 7. And we can see that that is equivalent to the total number of cats that we have here, which we could view as what we just circled off in this orangish pink color, which would be 4 rows of 5. So that would be equal to 4 times 5, 4 times 5. And then to that, we can add this second group of cat heads or angry cat heads, and that is 4 rows of 2. So that's 4 times 2. And we could put parentheses if we want, just to make it a little bit more readable. Now, why did I do that? Well, some folks might find 4 times 5 a little bit more straightforward. I could skip count by 5. I can go 5, 10, 15, 20. Also, 4 times 2 might be a little bit more straightforward. And so it could be easier to say, hey, this is just going to be 4 times 5, which is 20, plus 4 times 2, which is equal to 8. And so that is just going to be equal to 28. And you could have thought about it the same way down here with what is sometimes called a tape diagram. We could say, all right, if I have 5 4s, that's this amount right over here. That is the 4 times the 5. And then I could add that to the 2 4s, the 4 times the 2 right over here. And that's another way to get to 4 times 7. So the big picture here is, even if you're not dealing with 4 times 7, even if you're not dealing with angry cats, and in most of our lives we actually try to avoid angry cats, there might be a way to break down the numbers that you're multiplying into ones that you might be more familiar with. I'll give you one more example. Let's say someone were to ask you, well, what is 6 times 9? Pause this video and see if you can break this down in some useful way. Well, maybe you know what 6 times 10 is, and you also know what 6 times 1 is. So you could rewrite 9 as 10 minus 1. Well, then this would mean that 6 times 9 is the same thing as 6 times 10 minus 1. Based on exactly what we just did up here, that says that this whole thing is going to be the same thing as 6 times 10 minus 6 times 1. One way to think about it is I just distributed the 6. That's the distributive property right over there. And then 6 times 10 is equal to 60. And then 6 times 1 is equal to 6. And it might be easier for me to say, hey, 16 minus 6 in my head, that's equal to 54. So I know what some of you are thinking. 6 times 9 seems so clean, and now I've involved all of this other symbols, and I've written down more numbers. But at the end of the day, I'm trying to give you skills for breaking down problems, and including ways that you might want to do it in your head. If you're like, hey, I'm kind of foggy on what 6 times 9 is, but 6 times 10, hey, I know that's 60, and 6 times 1, of course, that's 6. Well, what if I view this as 6 times 10 minus 1? And then I could tackle it and get 54. And once again, you might know 6 times 9. You might know 4 times 7. But in the future, it might be useful for bigger and bigger numbers to think about how can I break this down?